Before the terror begins, I want to know, which country are you watching this video from? Leave it in the comments. My name is Leo. Back then, it was around 2012, I was just a kid, maybe 10 years old, and my life revolved around two things: my video games and the strange, quiet rhythm of our small suburban street. It was the kind of street where everybody knew everybody, where kids played kickball until the streetlights came on, and where the biggest drama was usually a misplaced garden gnome. Our next-door neighbor, Mr. Abernathy, was a cornerstone of that world. He was in his late 60s, a retired woodworker with gnarled hands and a laugh that sounded like a bunch of dry leaves being crunched underfoot. He'd always have a pack of sugar-free gummy bears for us kids and would spend hours showing me how to carve little wooden birds on his front porch. His wife had passed away years before, so it was just him and his scruffy old dog, Barnaby, a mutt with one ear that always flopped over his eye, giving him a sort of permanently mischievous look. Mr. Abernathy was one of those people who just made the world feel a little bit safer, a little bit cozier. His absence, when it came, felt like a hole had been punched in the fabric of our little community. The whole thing started on a Tuesday, a day that was supposed to be just like any other. I remember it vividly because it was the day my dad promised to help me build a ramp for my skateboard, a project I'd been nagging him about for weeks. We were out in the garage, the humid summer air thick with the smell of sawdust and fresh-cut pine, when my mom came running in from the kitchen, her face a pale mask of confusion. She said Mrs. Gable from across the street had called, worried because she hadn't seen Mr. Abernathy all morning. It was weird, because he was a creature of habit. Every day, like clockwork, he'd be out on his porch at 7:30 a.m. sharp, sipping coffee and watching the sunrise with Barnaby curled up at his feet. When we went over to check, the house was silent. The front door was unlocked, his coffee mug was still on the porch swing, but there was no sign of him. Barnaby wasn't there, either. The silence of the house was so loud it felt like it had its own weight. A few hours later, his family showed up, two sons I'd never seen before, dressed in fancy suits, looking too clean for the dusty, suburban street we lived on. They told the few neighbors who had gathered there that their father had gone on a trip and not to worry. But the way they said it, so calm, so devoid of any real emotion, just didn't sit right with anyone. It felt rehearsed, like a bad actor trying to remember a line. Things went from strange to outright unsettling pretty quickly. That night, after the sun had gone down and the street was bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights, I was in my bedroom, trying to beat a level on my Nintendo DS. My window faced Mr. Abernathy's backyard, and I could see the whole thing from my bed. At around 11 p.m., I saw a light flicker in his house. It was a single, strong beam, like from a big flashlight, moving behind the curtains of his living room window. It moved slowly, methodically, and I could tell it wasn't just someone fumbling around in the dark. It was too deliberate. It was like they were scanning the room, searching for something specific. I got a little jolt of fear, you know, the kind of irrational fear a kid gets, and I pulled the blankets up over my head. I tried to tell myself it was just one of his sons, maybe looking for a box of old photos or something. But the light kept moving, a ghost dancing in the darkness of the Abernathy house, and the thought of it made a cold pit form in my stomach. The next day was even weirder. I was out in our backyard, kicking a soccer ball around, and I noticed something strange in Mr. Abernathy's yard. There were patches of dirt that looked like they'd been freshly disturbed. They were too symmetrical, too clean to be just random holes dug by an animal. It looked like someone had dug a series of shallow, circular holes, each maybe a foot or so across, and then filled them back in. There were about 5 of them, arranged in a neat line near the fence that separated our properties. I remember bending down and poking one with the toe of my shoe. The dirt was loose, dark, and still damp. I thought maybe they were planting something, but there were no seeds or bulbs anywhere. And the ground around them was completely clean, not a single speck of dirt out of place. It was like whoever did it had meticulously cleaned up after themselves. That night, the flashlight came on again, this time in the backyard, and I heard a low, scraping sound, a rhythmic schschschsch, like something heavy was being dragged across the ground. It was a sound that got under your skin, a sound that just shouldn't be there. I pressed my face against my window, trying to see, but the shadows were too deep. All I could make out was the flashlight beams swinging erratically, sometimes disappearing, sometimes reappearing, as if whatever was being dragged was too big and awkward to handle. One day, a guy on our street, a younger fella named Mark who lived a few houses down, had enough. He told everyone he was going to set up his old camcorder in his bedroom window to see what the hell was going on. We all thought he was a bit nuts, but we were all so terrified and curious we didn't stop him. I remember him saying something like, "Someone has to do it. It's too weird, and I'm not a coward." He was a tall guy, all lanky with this shock of red hair that always seemed to stand on end, and he had this nervous energy about him, like he was always on the verge of jumping out of his skin. He set up the camera, aimed at Mr. Abernathy's backyard, and left it running all night. The next morning, he was pale, not just tired, but that kind of white as a sheet pale you get when you've seen something you can't unsee. He called everyone to his house, and we all gathered in his cramped living room, the air thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee. He told us he had been woken up by the same dragging sound, and that he had gone to his window to look. He was shaking as he told us this. He said he saw a figure, a silhouette. Really, it was too dark to make out details, dragging something across the yard. The shape was human, but it moved with an unnerving, jerky gait, like it was struggling with an immense weight. The object it was dragging was long and shapeless, wrapped in what looked like a dark, heavy blanket or sack. He showed us the footage, and my stomach dropped. The image was grainy, black and white, but you could clearly see the outline of the person and the sack. The sound on the video was what really got to me, though. That same sickening schhhh sound I had heard the night before, only now it was amplified, clear, and horrifying. The figure dragged the sack to one of those freshly filled holes near the fence, and with a final, desperate heave, it shoved the whole thing into the ground. Then it took a shovel, which must have been leaning against the fence, and started packing the dirt back in with a quiet, efficient rhythm. The shovel was what broke me. It was so mundane, so normal. A shovel, doing something so utterly, profoundly wrong. The figure finished, wiped the shovel on the grass, and disappeared into the shadows of the house. The next day, Mark called the police again, this time with the footage. They showed up in force. 2 officers, one tall and burly with a bushy mustache, and another, younger one with a serious face. They had a search warrant and spent the whole day at Mr. Abernathy's house, going through the yard with a fine-toothed comb. They used metal detectors, dug up a few of those suspicious spots, but found nothing, not a single thing. The ground was packed solid, and they told Mark there was no evidence of recent digging. It was impossible. We all saw the footage. We knew they had dug there. I remember my dad going over to talk to the officers. He was a practical man, a carpenter, and he knew a freshly dug patch of dirt when he saw one. He pointed to the exact spot we all saw on the video, but the police just looked at him with these blank, skeptical eyes. They said the ground was undisturbed and that the film was too blurry to be considered evidence. It was like they weren't seeing the same thing we were. It was so maddening and confusing. The tall officer just sighed and told my dad they'd keep an eye out for Mr. Abernathy, but that they had no reason to suspect foul play. They packed up their gear and left, leaving us all standing there, feeling like we were losing our minds. That a couple of days later, the weirdness escalated to a whole new level. I was playing outside when I saw Mark walking across our lawn, looking even more rattled than before. He had an envelope clutched in his hand, his knuckles white against the paper. He didn't say a word, just slid the envelope under my front door and walked away, not even making eye contact. He had this look in his eyes like he was watching a train wreck in slow motion, unable to look away. I ran inside, my heart pounding in my chest, and picked it up. The envelope was plain, no address, no stamp, just a stark white rectangle. Inside was a single, glossy photograph. It was a picture of the Abernathy family's living room, taken from a low angle, maybe from the floor. The room was tidy, everything in its place, just as it had been. But in the huge mirror on the wall, the reflection showed a figure standing right behind the camera. It was Mr. Abernathy, and he was smiling. Not a warm, gummy bear-giving smile, but a wide, unnerving grin. His eyes were wide and fixed, staring directly into the lens. The photo wasn't blurry, it wasn't grainy. It was perfectly, terrifyingly clear that I stood there on the doormat, just staring at that picture, my 10-year-old brain trying to process something that felt like a logic puzzle designed by a demon. The knot of fear in my stomach tightened into a vice. I didn't get it. How was he in the photo? Why was he smiling like that? I couldn't tear my eyes away from his reflection, from the way his eyes seemed to follow me. I finally scrambled to my feet and ran to show my parents. My mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and my dad took the photo, his eyebrows furrowed in confusion and then slowly dread. He held it up, turning it over and over, as if looking for a trick, a string, anything that could explain it. There was no explanation, just the horrifying image of our missing neighbor, standing in a room we all thought was empty, and smiling a smile that wasn't warm or friendly, but full of a chilling, profound malice. The fact that it was slipped under our door meant it was meant for us. A personal message, a threat. After a few frantic, hushed minutes of my parents debating what to do, my dad tried calling Mark, the guy who took the picture. There was no answer. He tried again, and again. Nothing. It was like he had vanished, too. My parents looked at each other, and I saw a new kind of fear on their faces, something deeper than the confusion from before. We were on our own now. The police had already dismissed us, and now the one person who had been brave enough to investigate had disappeared. The Abernathy house next door, which had always been a source of comfort, now felt like a living, breathing monster, its windows like dark eyes watching us. We started doing things we never did before. We closed our blinds early, even on the hottest summer nights. My mom started locking the doors the second we got home. I couldn't bring myself to play in the backyard anymore. Every time I looked out my window, I imagined him there, just out of sight, a ghostly smile fixed on his face, a hand on his shovel, waiting till we fell into a horrifying new routine after that. The Abernathy house, which used to be a point of comfort, a reassuring presence, became a black hole of dread. Its silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the silence of a predator, waiting. My mom started acting like a sentry, her face pressed against the kitchen window, watching. My dad, a practical man who'd always scoffed at ghost stories, started carrying his old baseball bat with him as he went from room to room, a silent, grim guardian. My own room, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. I'd lie awake at night, my eyes glued to the window, the slightest creak in the floorboards sending a jolt of panic through me. A new thing started happening, something that got under my skin in a way the others didn't. A faint, sweet, cloying smell that would sometimes waft through my open window. It smelled like overly ripe fruit and damp earth, a sickeningly sweet aroma that felt all wrong for the summer air. The terror reached a new peak a few nights later. It was late, maybe 2 a.m, and the humid air was heavy and still. I was trying and failing to fall asleep when I heard a sound. It wasn't the dragging noise this time. This was different, quieter, but even more chilling because it was so close. It was a rhythmic, dull thump-thump-thump coming from right outside my window. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. It sounded like someone was tapping on the ground, but with something heavy and dense, like a small, blunt tool. The sound went on for maybe 5 full minutes. My curiosity and my fear finally won out. I crept out of bed, and, my heart in my throat, I peeled back the edge of the curtain just a little bit. In the pale moonlight, I saw a figure kneeling on the ground, right next to the fence that separated our properties. I couldn't see their face, but they were hunched over, their movements precise and deliberate. They were holding something in their hand, and with each thump, they were driving it into the soil. I could hear the muffled thwack of the tool as it hit the dirt. My blood ran cold when I finally saw what it was. It was a spade, a small, handheld gardening spade, like the kind my mom used. And they were digging a new hole. Right there, right next to our fence, right where I would have been playing soccer just a few weeks ago. The hole was small, no bigger than a shoebox, but the sight of it felt like a final, terrifying violation of our space that I didn't think twice. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I scrambled back into bed, pulling the covers over my head, but I couldn't unsee the image of that small figure and that tiny spade. The sound of that thwack against the dirt was still echoing in my head. I finally burst out of my room and ran to my parents' door, my voice a strangled sob. It took a few tries for them to understand what I was saying, but when they did, my dad got up, grabbed his baseball bat, and went to look. I watched from the window as he stood there, frozen, the beam of his flashlight cutting a path through the darkness, illuminating the fresh, dark soil. He didn't have to dig to know. The disturbed earth was a beacon of dread, a clear message left by someone who wanted us to see it. That night was the longest of my life. The unspoken question hung in the air, thick and heavy. What was in that hole? And why was it so close to our house? The smiling reflection in the photo now felt like a taunt, a silent confirmation that he was out there, watching us, playing a sick game with our lives as the pawns. The next day was a blur of terrified whispers. We couldn't go to the police again. They would just tell us we were crazy. My dad, bless his brave, foolish heart, made a decision. He said we had to know. We couldn't live with this creeping dread forever. We had to dig up that hole. We waited until it was well past midnight. My dad grabbed a full-sized shovel from the garage. My mom held a massive flashlight, and I, shaking like a leaf, held my phone, ready to record. The air was thick with tension and that cloying, sickening smell. We walked silently to the spot. My dad planted his foot on the shovel and pushed it into the soil. The dirt came up easily. The hole was only about a foot deep, and it took him maybe 3 scoops to hit something. There, nestled in the damp earth, wasn't a bone or a weapon. It was a small, hand-carved wooden bird, just like the ones Mr. Abernathy used to make for me. The wood was smooth, a little misshapen, but unmistakably his work. But it wasn't the bird that made me sick. It was the eye. Staring up at us from the bird's tiny face was not a painted pupil, but a small, black, perfectly round camera lens, glinting in the beam of my mom's flashlight. And my mom let out a small, strangled scream, and my dad just stood there, the shovel handle slipping from his numb fingers. The sick truth of it all hit us like a tidal wave. The flickering flashlights? They weren't fumbling in the dark. They were adjusting the cameras, placing them perfectly. The digging? Not for bodies, but for these terrifying little devices. The dragging sound? Maybe a bag full of them, or something even more sophisticated. We hadn't been watching a search for a missing man. We had been watching a madman set up a surveillance network around our neighborhood. The photo he sent wasn't just a taunt. It was a confession. He was never missing. He was always there, or had someone else there for him, always watching us. The kind, smiling neighbor we all knew was gone, replaced by this chilling, unknown entity who had meticulously turned our quiet suburban street into his own personal horror show on my dad. In a moment of pure, raw rage, brought the shovel down and smashed the wooden bird. The tiny camera lens shattered with a pathetic little tink. The sound felt like a victory, a final, definitive action against the unseen horror. We never went to the police again. We knew they wouldn't believe us, not when they had already dismissed the video and the disturbed earth. We made a decision that felt both cowardly and completely necessary. We moved. We packed up our lives in a frantic blur of boxes and whispers, leaving behind the house that had become a prison. We never saw Mr. Abernathy or his family again. His house on our old street stayed vacant, a monument to the fear he had inflicted upon us. I'm an adult now, with a family of my own, but to this day, I have a hard time leaving my blinds open at night. The knowledge that someone could be watching and that the kindest person you know could be a monster is a fear that never truly goes away. Dude, this happened a few years ago. I must have been in my early 20s, living alone for the first time, in that phase where you think you're invincible. My apartment was in an older neighborhood, with those big houses with large yards and rusty iron gates. I worked from home as an illustrator, which meant my routine was a complete mess. I'd spend all night drawing and would only go to sleep when the sun was already rising. And it was precisely because of this routine that I, without meaning to, became the only neighbor who actually noticed Mr. Alvarez, the neighbor who lived in the house at the end of the street. He was a recluse. I never saw him during the day, only at night. I'd hear his car engine start around 1 or 2 in the morning, and he'd only return when the sky was already getting light. He was like my mirrored version, only he seemed even more averse to any kind of contact. No one knew what he did or where he came from, only that he was the neighbor in the house at the end of the street, the one everyone said had a weird energy. His house was something out of a movie, you know? One of those dark wooden ones, with a porch covered in ivy and windows that looked like empty eyes. There was a huge tree in front, with twisted branches that looked like arms, and the garden was always half dead, with dry leaves and weeds growing. I always wondered what he did for a living. One night, while I was on my balcony smoking a cigarette, I saw his car pull in. He parked but didn't get out of the car. He stayed there for a good few minutes, with the lights off, just his silhouette visible. I found it strange but didn't give it much thought. I just thought he was tired. The last time I saw him was the following night. His car left, as usual, but he didn't come back the next morning, nor the one after that. And that's when the bizarre stuff started. His car, an old black Ford, remained parked in the driveway. Time passed, and the mailbox filled with letters and newspapers. And Mr. Alvarez simply vanished, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. It was strange because vanishing isn't like simply going on a trip. It was different. There was a palpable absence. It was about a week after he disappeared that the first strange event occurred. I was, as usual, drawing at my desk. It was around 3 in the morning, and the street was in that sepulchral silence of the early hours. Suddenly, the light in Mr. Alvarez's living room came on. I stopped drawing immediately. I swear, I thought it was Mr. Alvarez returning. I spent about 10 minutes looking out the window, waiting to see his silhouette, but nothing. The light stayed on, shining in the darkness, and it felt like the house was staring at me. My neighbors didn't notice anything. After all, they were all sleeping at that hour. But I knew it was strange. The light on, with no one home, was proof that something was wrong. I even thought about calling the police, but what would be my justification? My missing neighbor's light turned on by itself. They'd think I was crazy. On the following nights, things escalated. The light would turn on and off at random intervals. One night, I heard the sound of glass breaking coming from the house. I was frozen. It was a loud, unmistakable sound. But when I looked, the window was intact. And then, I started seeing shadows moving. They weren't shadows of people, but they looked more like dark blobs that squirmed and stretched across the wall. It was a shapeless thing, but it had movement, as if the darkness inside the house was alive. And the smell? I started to smell mold and damp earth, as if his basement had been opened, mixed with a metallic, slightly rusty smell. It was a suffocating smell that came from his house and seemed to invade my apartment. My throat would get dry, and I'd get chills down my spine just from smelling it. My whole body seemed to scream, "Get out of here." I got closer to the kitchen table, my heart pounding in my chest. That plate of food looked like a ghost, intact, but covered in a fine, old dust. I ran my hand over the table, and the dust came off, revealing the dark wood underneath. The house smelled of decades of abandonment, but the plate was recent. I leaned in, feeling the cold, dense air, and noticed something that made me freeze. The dust around the plate wasn't uniform. There were marks in the dust, as if something had dragged the plate across the table. And they weren't hand marks. They were thin, parallel lines, as if claws had moved it. I backed away quickly, my stomach churning again. My mind was trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe Mr. Alvarez had tried to do something and had been interrupted. But what were those marks? I turned around, and that's when I saw it. The living room walls were covered in messages. They weren't paintings or drawings. They were handwritten, in a messy, shaky handwriting, as if the person was in pain. The phrases repeated themselves, one after the other, covering the entire wall. "I am here, and you shouldn't have looked." They were there hundreds of times, in thick, black ink. The ink looked recent, and the metallic smell I'd felt outside was of ink, but it had a nauseating undertone, like the smell of blood. Fear completely paralyzed me. The messages didn't look like they were written by a human being. The handwriting was unstable. It looked like the person who wrote it was in a state of panic. It didn't seem normal. I could barely breathe. My throat was dry. The phrases seemed to be screaming at me. It was as if the house itself was warning me. I was panicking, but I couldn't leave. My feet were glued to the floor. I looked at the wall again, and something in the middle of the repeated phrases caught my attention. A line of text that stood out, written in the same handwriting, but with a different urgency. "He is waiting." Who was waiting? And where? And what the hell had happened to Mr. Alvarez? I couldn't think. My brain seemed to have shut down. I just stared, fixated on the walls, absorbing the madness of it all. It was then that I heard the sound. A sound that didn't come from inside the house, but from outside. Outside the living room window, I heard a soft scratching. The sound of nails scraping against the glass, coming from outside. They were long, heavy nails. The sound was slow, measured. I turned abruptly, my heart racing. I approached the window. Outside, the night was dark and silent. There was nothing, but the sound continued. I put my hand on the glass, feeling the cold from outside, and the sound stopped. It was as if the thing on the other side knew I was there, that I was listening. I moved away from the window, and I started to hear it again, but this time, it wasn't at the living room window. It was at the upstairs bedroom window. The same sound, nails scraping the glass, begging to get in, or to get out. I couldn't tell. The sound was persistent and seemed to move around the entire house, as if what was outside was running and scratching every window it found. I closed my eyes. I didn't want to see anything anymore. I didn't want to know anything anymore. And I understood. The lights turning on, the shadows, the dragging. They weren't things getting into the house. They were things trying to get out. And the reason Mr. Alvarez had disappeared was because he had found what was inside. I felt sick. I needed to get out of there, but my body wouldn't obey me. The scratching sound on the windows stopped, and suddenly, everything was silent again. A silence that was heavy, that was suffocating. I looked at the kitchen door, and it was closed. I was sure I had left it ajar, but now it was closed. My head spun. The house seemed to have a life of its own, a life that didn't want me there. I started to smell the same mold and earth smell, only stronger, coming from a closed door in the corner of the room. An old wooden door with a rusty iron latch. It was the basement door, and the smell of iron, which I had mistaken for ink, I now knew what it was. It was the smell of blood. My stomach churned, and I tasted metal in my mouth. I was in a panic. I started to feel my heart pounding against my ribs, and the air got thicker, heavier. I could barely breathe, and I looked at the basement door. It started to move slowly. The iron doorknob turned, and the door creaked, opening. And that's when I ran. I ran like I had never run in my life. I threw myself on the floor, the cold air of my apartment hitting my face. I was gasping, feeling the hot tears running down my face. I crawled to my room and hid under the covers. I couldn't stop shaking. I spent the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling, not daring to look out the window. The next day, I called the police. I told them everything, or almost everything. I said I heard noises at my neighbor's house, that the door was open, and that I had seen the whole room dirty. I didn't tell them about the messages on the wall, about the plate of food, about the nails scraping the glass. I knew they wouldn't believe me. They went there, and I saw them entering the house. I saw them leave, with a look of confusion. They told me there was nothing inside, that the house was intact, and that Mr. Alvarez had probably traveled. They gave me a strange look, as if I were crazy. They said there was nothing in the house, but the door was open, and the yard was a mess. I knew what I had seen. A few days later, Mr. Alvarez's house was sealed off. The police didn't find anything, and the story was forgotten. But I never forgot. The smell of damp earth and blood, the messages on the wall, the nails on the glass, the basement door. I moved apartments the following month, but even today, when I pass by old houses, I get a shiver. I know there's something in there, something that's waiting. And I know Mr. Alvarez didn't travel. He's still there. And if you walk past his house, in silence, you can still hear it. It's not a cry for help. It's a warning. The sound of nails scraping against the glass, coming from inside. I remember once, months later, I drove past the house. It was night. I was on my way home from work, and I heard it. It wasn't a scratch. It was a knock, loud, as if the thing in there was hitting the window. It knocked 3 times, and it stopped. And I knew, the thing is no longer begging to get out. It's having fun. And Mr. Alvarez is no longer there. He is the thing, and he's waiting for someone. The year was 2018, and I was 26, living in this quiet little suburban neighborhood where everyone pretty much kept to themselves, but in a friendly way, you know? My life back then was simple. I worked as a freelance graphic designer, which meant my days were pretty much spent hunched over a glowing screen, and my nights were for takeout and binging old sitcoms. I was the definition of an introvert. My only real connection to the outside world, besides the occasional grocery run, was this strange but comforting routine I shared unknowingly with my neighbor. His name was Arthur. I didn't know him well. Maybe we'd exchanged a few waves across our lawns, but he was a constant, a landmark in the rhythm of our street. Every single morning, like clockwork, at exactly 5:30 a.m., You'd hear the soft thud of his front door closing, followed by the steady rhythm of his jogging shoes hitting the pavement. It was so reliable that I swear you could set your watch by him. He'd always have this little headlamp strapped on, a weirdly bright, almost blinding beam cutting through the pre-dawn gloom, and his headphones were these massive, vintage-looking things that made him look like he was preparing for a mission. It was the kind of predictability that you just take for granted. That morning, though, everything felt off. It was a Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday that feels like a Monday's grumpy older brother. The air was thick with a kind of heavy, wet cold that seeps into your bones, and a thin, gray fog was hugging the street, making everything look hazy and unfamiliar. I was up late, as usual, working on a client's last-minute revision, and I remember looking at my clock, seeing it tick past 5:25 a.m. My mind, still half asleep and foggy, was already anticipating the familiar sounds of Arthur's routine. I even leaned closer to the window, half expecting to see his little headlamp bobbing in the distance. The streetlights had that eerie halo effect, their orange glow blurring into the mist. I waited. 5:30 came and went. Then 5:31. Nothing. My brain, wired for routine, just couldn't process the silence. It was like a beat had been skipped in a song I knew by heart. It felt wrong. It was just a weird feeling at first, a tiny prickle of unease. I went back to my work, trying to shake it off, telling myself maybe he was sick or slept in, but the quiet absence of that sound just hung in the air, a heavy, unsettling weight that I couldn't ignore. At BY midday, the whole street was buzzing. The kind of buzz you get when something's broken the routine. Kids were walking home from school, pointing at Arthur's house, and the adults were out on their lawns in small, hushed groups, their voices low and laced with a mix of curiosity and concern. I overheard Mrs. Gable, a sweet, old lady with a cloud of white hair and a reputation for knowing everything about everyone, talking to my next-door neighbor, Mark. She was saying how she'd called Arthur's office after he didn't show up for work, and they hadn't heard from him. That was when the first real jolt of fear hit me. It wasn't just a skipped run. Something was genuinely wrong. It was one thing for a person to be late, but to just not exist? That's when I knew this was bigger than me. I went inside and watched from my living room window as the police arrived, their patrol cars a stark contrast to the quiet, suburban street. The sight of them made my stomach churn with an icy dread that was completely new to me. That I watched as two officers, a tall, stern-looking woman with a rigid posture and a younger, more laid-back man, approached Arthur's front door. They knocked, waited, knocked again, then they tried the handle. It didn't budge. I saw them walk around the side of the house, peering into the windows, their flashlights creating these dancing, frantic circles of light in the dim interior. They were there for what felt like hours, talking on their radios, taking notes. I remember noticing how the house itself seemed to be holding its breath. The curtains were drawn just so, a detail that stood out because Arthur was the kind of guy who always had his blinds wide open to let the light in. The whole scene felt like a paused movie, with every detail unnaturally still and silent. The air outside felt colder, heavier, and the fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it seemed to have thickened, pressing in on the street like a wool blanket. That's when the younger officer, the one with the easy smile, put his hand on his partner's arm and pointed towards the back of the house. They both paused, their heads tilted in unison, as if listening to something only they could hear, and then they moved with a sudden, purposeful urgency towards the back of the property, their shadows stretching long and distorted in the weak afternoon light. Something had changed. They didn't find a broken window or a forced entry. The officers came back around to the front, their faces a mixture of confusion and a cold, professional grimness. They spent another half hour on their radios, their voices a static-filled mumble from my window. It was clear whatever they'd found, or hadn't found, had only deepened the mystery. Soon, the news began to trickle through our neighborhood group chat. Someone had pulled their home security camera footage, and it showed Arthur's usual path, all the way to the narrow, unlit alleyway that cut through the block. The footage was grainy, but it was him, clear as day, with his weird vintage headphones and his tiny, bobbing flashlight beam disappearing into the blackness of the alley. And then, the next video showed the other side of the alley, the part that spit you out onto the main avenue. There was nothing, just empty sidewalk. He didn't come out. The footage was verified by a dozen other cameras, all confirming the same bizarre fact. Arthur walked in and simply never emerged. The police took the footage and left, their final glances at the locked house conveying a profound and unnerving bewilderment. That night was different. The streetlights seemed dimmer, and the silence was suffocating, punctuated only by the occasional distant siren. I couldn't tear my eyes away from Arthur's house. I was just sitting there, staring, a cup of cold coffee long forgotten on the table beside me. The blinds were still drawn, just the way he'd left them. But then, as the last vestiges of twilight faded, I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible shadow behind the living room window. I squinted, leaning closer to my own pane of glass. It wasn't a trick of the light. There was a silhouette, an unnaturally tall and thin figure, standing perfectly still. My blood ran cold. It wasn't Arthur. He was a stocky guy, built solid like a brick wall. This thing was all angles and lines, its frame impossibly elongated, almost spindly. But the worst part, the part that made the hairs on my arms stand up like little sentinels, was that it wasn't just standing there. It was staring directly out, its faceless form seeming to look right through the window, through my window, and straight into me. The longer I stared, the more it felt like it wasn't just a silhouette, but a negative space, a void that was consuming the light around it. And it didn't move, not an inch. It was just a statue of nothingness, and it was watching the street that I couldn't just stand there and stare, but I couldn't look away either. My hands, clammy and trembling, fumbled for the pair of old binoculars I kept on the windowsill for bird watching. I pressed them to my eyes, the cold metal shocking against my skin. The figure was now a terrifyingly clear, yet completely incomprehensible image. It wasn't a shadow, it was a solid, three-dimensional void. A negative space carved into the air, with no features, no clothes, nothing. Just the perfect, unnaturally straight outline of a human form, but taller, skinnier, like a shadow puppet stretched and elongated. Its stance was so rigid, so completely motionless, that it didn't even seem to be breathing. I watched, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for a twitch, a flicker, anything to prove it was a person, a prank, a joke. But it never came. The thing just stood there, a silent sentinel, a statue made of pure darkness, and its vacant space where a face should be was just a black void staring directly at me. It felt like I was looking at something that didn't belong in this world, and the sheer emptiness of it was more terrifying than any monster could ever be. Hours passed, and the feeling of being watched never faded. I was still glued to my window, the binoculars a permanent fixture against my eyes, unable to move, unable to breathe properly. The street was deserted. No car lights, no late-night walkers. Just the eerie glow of the streetlights and the suffocating silence. Then, a low hum broke the quiet. Two unmarked police cruisers pulled up, their lights off, a stark contrast to the flashing chaos of the afternoon. A few officers got out, their movements more fluid and purposeful this time, more like they knew exactly what they were looking for. They went straight to the front door, not bothering to knock, and one of them produced a key and, to my horror, unlocked it. I held my breath as the door swung open with a soft, ominous creak. I was watching through the binoculars the whole time. As the first officer stepped inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, I frantically scanned for the silhouette. But it was gone. The space where it had been standing, that perfect, hollow cutout, was just a regular, empty room. My stomach dropped. The chilling realization that it was gone, that it had just vanished, was almost more terrifying than seeing it there. The officers entered the house, their flashlights dancing on the walls, and the only thing I could think of was, what did I just see? They were inside for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes. Their flashlight beams danced across the walls, through the living room, into the kitchen. I could see them, these little circles of light, moving from left to right as if checking for something that wasn't there. From my vantage point, the house looked perfectly normal, a snapshot of a life abruptly paused. I could see the edge of a book left open on a coffee table, a pair of reading glasses beside it. The police were methodical, silent, their movements conveying a deep confusion. My eyes were fixed on them, trying to glean a single clue from their body language. They stopped in the kitchen, their flashlights converging on a single spot on the counter. One officer leaned in, his posture rigid with focus. The other one took out a pair of gloves. A few moments later, they both looked at each other, a shared expression of utter bewilderment on their faces, before one of them carefully placed something small and white into a clear evidence bag. Soon after, they emerged from the house, locking the door behind them with the same key. This time, they didn't look grim. They looked profoundly disturbed, their faces pale and their eyes wide with a sort of disbelieving dread. They got in their cruisers and drove away without a word. The entire neighborhood was on edge, our phones buzzing with 100 different theories. Then, the next day, the official police report was shared, a simple, cold statement that only deepened the horror. All the doors and windows had been locked from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle, no evidence of anything. Except for one thing, a single sheet of paper found on the kitchen table. The note was scribbled in haste, its letters uneven and panicked, but the words were hauntingly clear. It simply said, "I never left the alley." The moment I read those words, a cold, icy dread settled deep in my bones. It wasn't a call for help. It was a statement of fact, a message from beyond a place that was supposed to be a shortcut, a message that confirmed my worst fears. He didn't come out, and whatever was in his house, it wasn't him. He was still in the alley, trapped, while a piece of the darkness from that place had found its way out, and was now just standing there, watching.